There is a photograph that will be studied for decades. 7 leaders standing in front of the Canadian Rockies in Kananaskis, Alberta, on the 16th of June, 2025, posing for what is traditionally called the family photo at the Group of 7 summit. The mountains behind them are magnificent. The smiles are careful. And if you look closely at the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in one captured moment just before the formal pose, you can see her eyes roll as French President Emmanuel Macron whispers something in her ear during a roundtable discussion. That eye roll, caught on camera, broadcast around the world, was not a diplomatic accident. It was a human reaction to something that no diplomatic training fully prepares you for. The experience of sitting in the same room as the president of the most powerful nation on earth, listening to him propose things that the other 6 leaders could not agree to, could not endorse, and in several cases found genuinely alarming, and knowing that the only available response was a silence so carefully managed it had its own vocabulary. Because at the 50th anniversary summit of the Group of 7, the forum that had defined Western economic coordination for half a century, the silence was not a failure of diplomacy. It was the diplomacy. And understanding why requires understanding what Trump actually said in Kananaskis, what the other 6 leaders did not say back, and what that gap between the statement and the silence reveals about the most important alliance in the modern world, to understand the weight of what happened in Alberta in June of 2025. You have to understand what the G7 actually is and what it was designed to do. The Group of 7, which consists of the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, was created in 1975 as an informal gathering of the world's largest advanced democracies. The founding logic was simple. These were countries that shared not just economic power but political values. Liberal democracy, rule of law, open markets, collective security. And when those countries coordinated their economic and political positions, the world had to pay attention because together they represented the most concentrated combination of wealth, military capability, and institutional influence on Earth. For 50 years, the annual communique at the end of each G7 summit, the joint statement, signed by all 7 leaders, was one of the most carefully watched documents in global diplomacy. It was the signal that the Western democratic order was aligned, that the most powerful countries in the world had sat in a room, looked at the most pressing global problems, and agreed on a direction. And now, for the first time in the forum's history, there was no communique. Not because the leaders ran out of time, not because the issues were too complicated to summarize, because Canada, as the host nation, had decided in advance that attempting to produce one would be more damaging than not trying. And the reason for that decision was the same reason Giorgia Meloni's eyes were rolling during a roundtable discussion. Donald Trump was in the room. The decisions made in the weeks before the Kananaskis summit tell you more about the state of the Western alliance than anything that was said on camera. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, hosting his first G7, designed the entire agenda around one central constraint. That constraint was not Iran. It was not Ukraine. It was not trade. It was the risk that the American president would publicly reject whatever the other 6 agreed to, as he had done at the G7 in Charlevoix, Canada, in 2018, when he directed his representatives not to sign the economic section of the joint communique and then departed early and attacked the host nation. On social media from Air Force One, Carney's team made a deliberate decision. There would be no overarching communique. Only individual statements on specific issues. The summit agenda would avoid all mention of trade, climate change, global health threats, and poverty. Instead, the focus would be on issues where some consensus with Washington might be possible, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, critical minerals, and transnational crime. The word tariffs, the single most consequential economic policy the Trump administration had imposed on every single G7 member simultaneously, would not appear in any formal summit framing prepared by the host. This is what diplomatic accommodation looks like when it has been stretched to its absolute limit. You remove the problem from the agenda and hope the problem does not notice it has been removed. The problem noticed within 1 hour of the summit's official opening on June 16th, before the first formal session had even concluded. Trump stood before reporters and, unprompted, began talking about Russia. He said that the expulsion of Russia from what had been the Group of 8 in 2014 was a mistake. He said that in his view, the war in Ukraine would not have happened if Russia had remained a member. He said he thought Russia should come back, and when a reporter asked whether China should also be invited, Trump agreed. The other 6 leaders who were present heard a sitting American president at a G7 summit argue that Russia, which had invaded Ukraine in 2022, which had launched a full-scale war that had killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions more, which was at that moment continuing to shell Ukrainian cities, including a ballistic missile strike on Kyiv during the summit itself, should be welcomed back into the most important forum of Western democratic nations. Canadian Prime Minister Carney, who was standing nearby and could see the diplomatic situation deteriorating in real time, eventually stepped forward and gently encouraged the reporters to be on their way. The session had not yet officially started. There were 2 full days of meetings still ahead, and the most disruptive moment had already happened. What makes Trump's Russia remarks so consequential is not just what they said, but what they contradicted. For 3 years, the G7 had been the primary institutional mechanism through which the Western democratic world had coordinated its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The G7 had imposed coordinated sanctions. The G7 had organized support packages for Kyiv. The G7 had agreed at its 2024 summit to use proceeds from seized Russian assets to fund Ukrainian defense needs. The G7 had, in the assessment of experts at Chatham House, reached a high point in its cohesion and effectiveness in its collective response to the February 2022 invasion. Ukraine was not a peripheral issue for the forum. It was the defining achievement of the G7's most recent decade, and now the President of the United States was standing at the 50th anniversary summit of that forum and saying the entire premise of that collective response, the expulsion of Russia that created the unified front, was a mistake. The other 6 said nothing publicly. They continued with the summit. They consulted with each other. They held bilateral meetings, and when the session on Ukraine happened, they held it without him, because Trump had already left. The departure came on the evening of June 16th, before the second day of scheduled sessions. Trump announced he was returning to Washington to deal with the intensifying conflict between Israel and Iran, which had seen Israeli strikes on Tehran and Iranian retaliatory missile attacks. The conflict was real and serious. No one disputed that the situation in the Middle East required the attention of the American president. But the timing and the consequences of the departure were significant in ways that went beyond the formal excuse. Trump's early exit meant he missed the scheduled session on Ukraine and the equally scheduled bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who had been invited to the summit by Carney specifically because of Ukraine's need for renewed international support. Zelenskyy had spent months trying to secure another meeting with Trump after a disastrous first encounter in the Oval Office in February, where Trump and Vice President G. Vance had publicly berated the Ukrainian president on live television. The G7 summit represented a carefully organized second opportunity. Trump left before it could happen. Zelenskyy, according to sources familiar with the situation, experienced what was described as resounding disappointment. He canceled his own planned press conference in Calgary the following day and left Alberta as well. A source close to the Ukrainian delegation asked simply, "What is there for him to say?" There was no answer because there was no meeting. Trump was also absent from the summit session involving outreach leaders from Australia, Brazil, India, Mexico, South Africa, and South Korea. Specifically, the session focused on energy security. These were the emerging and middle power nations that the G7 had been cultivating as partners in building a broader coalition around global challenges. The session without Trump proceeded anyway. So did the session on Ukraine. The remaining 6 leaders, joined by Zelenskyy and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, spent extensive time on Tuesday discussing Russia's war and what could be done. Canadian Prime Minister Carney announced that Canada would provide approximately $1.5 billion in new military assistance to Ukraine and impose new financial sanctions on Russia aimed at restricting its energy revenues and evasion tactics. He said Canada's support would be unwavering until a just peace was secured. He also pledged a total of $4.3 billion Canadian dollars in Ukraine-related support. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced new tariffs on Russia designed to force Moscow to the negotiating table, coordinated with other European members. Germany's Friedrich Merz said European G7 nations were preparing a communique on Iran specifying that Iran must not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons-capable material. France's Macron, described by Carney as providing essential and crucial leadership, was working the diplomatic edges of the summit on both the Middle East and Ukraine simultaneously. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba emphasized the importance of a negotiated resolution and security cooperation. Italy's Meloni was present for every session, All six were at the table. The chair at the head of the room, the one that had been set for the leader of the United States, was empty. The phrase that the Atlantic Council used to describe what Trump's trade policy had already created before the summit even began was the G6+1, a coalesced European, Canadian, and Japanese front on one side and the United States on the other. This formulation had already hardened well before anyone flew to Alberta. Trump had imposed 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum from every G7 member. He had imposed 25% tariffs on automobiles. He was charging a base 10% tax on imports from most countries and threatening to raise those rates after a 90-day negotiating period expired on July 9th. The tariffs applied to allies and adversaries alike with no distinction. Germany faced them. Japan faced them. Canada faced them. The United Kingdom, which had worked harder than almost any other country to maintain positive relations with the Trump administration, faced them. When the leaders arrived in Kananaskis, they brought with them the specific trade grievances of entire national economies that were being damaged by policies emanating from the country hosting the summit's chair. And the host nation, Canada, had decided in advance not to put that subject formally on the agenda because doing so would risk a public rupture. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, speaking to reporters before the first session began, said he hoped there might be steps toward a solution to the tariff dispute, even if a full solution could not be reached at the summit itself. There won't be a solution at this summit, Merz said, but we could perhaps take small steps toward a solution. That sentence, from the leader of Europe's largest economy, delivered at the most important annual forum of Western democratic nations, contained within it a complete diagnosis of what the alliance had become, not a forum for coordination, not a mechanism for collective action. A room where six leaders could, at best, hope for small steps from a seventh who had imposed the largest tariff regime since 1947 on his own closest partners and was now suggesting that the country that invaded Ukraine should be welcomed back to the table. Japan's Ishiba told reporters he was seeking a trade deal with the United States that benefits both countries and that he had had a frank discussion with Trump. No deal was reached. A follow-up call was scheduled after the NATO summit. Britain's Starmer signed a limited trade framework with Trump, reducing tariffs on British automobiles from 25% to 10% for the first 100,000 imported annually and removing some aerospace levies. The deal had been announced in May and was formalized in Kananaskis. When Trump brandished the pages of the agreement for cameras and then dropped them, Starmer bent down and picked them up off the floor. He later explained that strict security protocols meant no one else could get close to the president, so he picked up the papers himself rather than leave them there. It was a small moment, but it was one that diplomats and observers noted carefully. The British Prime Minister, the leader of one of the world's oldest democracies, bent down to pick up papers dropped by the American president on a summit stage, and then he stood back up and said, "Thank you." The absence of a final joint communique at the 50th anniversary G7 summit was described by analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations as underscoring the deepening policy divisions among members. The European Parliament's Research Service noted that while several joint statements were issued, including one on the Israel-Iran crisis, no final G7 leaders' communique was adopted, contrary to previous summits. American University's School of International Service, analyzing the summit directly afterward, concluded that the leaders could not agree on a joint statement on the Ukraine war because of U.S. resistance, calling it a stark contrast to previous years where the G7 had played a key role in coordinating sanctions against Russia. The Atlantic Council's Rachel Rizzo, a senior fellow at the Europe Center, wrote that the G7 today risks becoming an increasingly irrelevant talking shop, much like the United Nations Security Council, unable to address many of the defining challenges of the 21st century. That was not a fringe assessment. It was a mainstream conclusion from the most credible transatlantic policy institution in Washington. The summit produced one outcome that illustrated, with clarity unusual in diplomatic proceedings, the difference between what a forum can do when its most powerful member is engaged and what it can do when that member is present in body but absent in purpose. Trump initially refused to sign even the limited joint statement on the Israel-Iran conflict before eventually agreeing to it after changes were made. The statement called for de-escalation of hostilities and affirmed Israel's right to self-defense, characterizing Iran as the principal source of regional instability and terror. That statement was signed. But the statement on Ukraine, the conflict that had defined the G7's most important collective achievement of the past 3 years, was never agreed. A senior Canadian official initially told reporters that the United States had pushed to soften any possible joint statement on Ukraine. That briefing was later retracted by the Prime Minister's office. What is not in dispute is the outcome. There was no joint statement on Ukraine. The country that had been the focus of the Western democratic world's most consequential collective action in a generation did not receive a unified statement of support from the G7 at the summit where its president was physically in attendance. And the 6 leaders who would have signed such a statement held their session on Ukraine only after the American chair had been vacated. What the Kananaskis summit revealed is something that diplomatic language struggles to name directly, but that the data and the record make unmistakable. For 50 years, the G7 functioned on an assumption. The assumption was that the United States wanted to lead, that it came to these summits with an agenda for Western collective action, with proposals, with frameworks, with the institutional commitment to producing a communique that bound all 7 governments to a shared direction. That assumption is now operationally invalid. The summit hosts spent months designing an agenda to avoid provoking the American president. She removed from consideration the most important topics facing the global economy, including the very tariffs the American president had imposed on the other 6 members. She eliminated the communique rather than risk having it rejected. She managed the schedule to minimize confrontation, and even after all of that careful preparation, the American president arrived, proposed that a country at war with a neighbor should be welcomed back to the Forum of Democratic Nations, declined to join new sanctions on that country, and then left before meeting the leader of the nation being invaded. The remaining 6 carried on. They held their sessions, issued their statements, pledged their support, and announced their individual commitments. Canada pledged 4.3 billion Canadian dollars for Ukraine. 6 countries issued statements, 6 chairs remained occupied, and the conclusion that the world drew from watching all of it was precisely what the forum's architects had spent 50 years trying to prevent anyone from concluding that the G7 could function without. American leadership, not as well, not at full strength, but function. And that the most consequential thing the United States did at the 50th anniversary of the forum it had helped create and had led for half a century was demonstrate, through absence and disruption and the proposal to readmit a country conducting an active war against a European democracy, that American leadership of the Western order was no longer a given. It was a question, and the 6 leaders who stayed in their chairs after the 7th had boarded Air Force One were not answering that question with words. They were answering it with the simple fact of their continued presence. The world was watching, and what it saw was 7 chairs, 6 occupied, and a silence that spoke more clearly than any communique that was never written. Subscribe, because the next G7, scheduled for 2026 in Evian, France, will carry the weight of everything that was not resolved in Alberta, and the question of what the Western democratic order looks like when its founding power no longer fully wants to lead it is one that every government on earth is now calculating an answer to. Whether they say so publicly or not,